When most people today picture the Middle Ages, the image that comes to mind is often that of a great banquet hall, lit by torchlight, where long tables groan under the weight of roasted boars, golden chalices brimming with wine, and jesters entertaining a court of knights and ladies. This vision, though drawn partly from truth, represents only a narrow slice of medieval reality. For the vast majority of people who lived between the 5th and 15th centuries, meals were not grand occasions of abundance but daily struggles with scarcity, monotony, and survival. The myth of constant feasting belonged to kings, nobles, and church elites, while ordinary men, women, and children often lived on diets that were shockingly plain, repetitive, and, in times of crisis, even deadly. At the very top of society, lords and monarchs indeed indulged in extraordinary banquets that were carefully designed not only to fill the stomach but to demonstrate power, wealth, and divine favor. In a noble feast, one might find entire peacocks roasted and then dressed back in their feathers to create a spectacular centerpiece. There were pies filled with live birds that would fly out when cut open, gilded meats covered with gold leaf, and exotic ingredients imported across vast distances, cinnamon from Ceylon, saffron from the Mediterranean, pepper from India. These banquets were less about nourishment and more about display. They were political theater, meant to astonish guests and reinforce hierarchies. Yet such excesses were rare and reserved for special occasions such as weddings, coronations, or religious festivals. Even nobles did not eat in this lavish style every day. The everyday meals of the nobility were more modest, though still far superior to those of common folk. They enjoyed white bread made from finely sifted wheat, roasted meats, cheeses, and a variety of fish. Their tables were flavored with spices that were prohibitively expensive for anyone below their rank. To eat pepper or cloves was a sign of status, and so the ability to season one's meat became a silent language of wealth. Even the simplest meal in a lord's household reflected privilege, to eat beef or venison regularly while peasants were lucky to taste such meat once or twice a year. For the majority of the population, food meant survival, not spectacle. The cornerstone of a peasant's diet was bread, but not the soft white loaves of the wealthy. Instead, peasants ate coarse, dark bread made from rye, barley, or oats. This bread was often hard, dense, and sometimes contaminated with ergot fungus, which could cause hallucinations and even death. Alongside bread, the most common meal was pottage, a thick, soupy mixture of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables or scraps could be found. This could be flavored with onions, leeks, or garlic when available, but rarely did it include meat. For many peasants, meat was a luxury associated only with festivals or hunts sanctioned by the lord. Ale was another crucial part of the diet, especially in villages. Because water sources were frequently contaminated, weak beer became the safest and most reliable drink. Men, women, and even children consumed it daily. Peasants drank small ale, a light brew with little alcohol content, primarily to quench thirst. It was as common as bread, and brewing ale at home became a routine chore for many households. Milk, too, was consumed, though often quickly turned into butter or cheese to preserve it longer. Seasonal hardship added further limits to diets. During the hungry gap in early spring, when the previous year's harvest had run out and new crops had not yet matured, peasants often survived on dried legumes, old onions, or whatever could be foraged from the woods. In times of famine, desperation drove communities to bake famine bread, which was made with ground-up acorns, roots, or even bark mixed into flour. Such bread not only tasted bitter but could cause digestive problems and weakness. Chronicles from the early 14th century describe mothers feeding their children loaves so rough and contaminated that they barely counted as food. Hunger shaped not only bodies but also minds. People lived with the constant fear of poor harvests, drought, or war cutting off food supplies. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 left Europe devastated, rains ruined crops, and starvation drove people to desperate measures. Some accounts claim villagers boiled animal hides for nourishment, while rumors spread of cannibalism in the most desperate regions. Whether or not every story was true, the fear it created was real. Food shortages left permanent scars on communities. Despite these struggles, food also carried deep symbolic and spiritual meaning. The act of eating was never merely physical, it was tied to one's place in society and one's standing before God. The church dictated what could be eaten and when, with numerous fast days on which meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. For peasants already deprived of protein, these restrictions added another layer of difficulty. Yet compliance was enforced by fear of sin, and so people replaced meat with salted fish, dried herring, or eels from rivers and ponds. This intersection of faith and hunger meant that a person's diet was as much about religious discipline as it was about nourishment. Meals were also social. A peasant family gathered around a wooden bowl of pottage, eating with spoons or pieces of bread. The household's limited food was shared communally, reflecting the bonds of survival. In a noble hall, meals were taken in stages, with servants carrying trenchers, flat pieces of stale bread used as plates, and musicians providing background entertainment. Even the way people sat at the table reflected hierarchy, the lord and his favored guests nearest the fire, servants and lower ranks farther away. Food reinforced order and reminded everyone of their place. It is easy to imagine medieval life as a colorful pageant of endless roasts and flowing wine, but this is a distortion. For every lord cutting into a gilded boar, there were hundreds of peasants scraping by on onions, cabbage, and bread that might have been stretched with bark or sawdust. For every noble woman sipping spiced wine, there were children drinking weak ale because water might kill them. And while paintings and chronicles preserve the splendor of noble banquets, the silence of hungry villagers is harder to record, though it was the defining experience of most medieval lives. The myth of feasting endures because it dazzles the imagination, but the reality was a society where food meant survival, status, and fear all at once. The medieval table, whether in a castle or a hut, told the story of inequality, faith, and the unending human struggle against hunger. It revealed a world where every bite was shaped by class, by religion, and by the fragile balance of nature. To understand what people ate in the Middle Ages is not to picture endless banquets, but to step into a landscape where scarcity was the rule and abundance the rare exception. And it is within this contrast, between myth and reality, between hunger and feast, that the true medieval experience of food can be found. If food was central to medieval survival, drink was no less essential. Yet the drinking habits of the Middle Ages might surprise modern audiences. For a society constantly battling sickness, plague, and poor sanitation, the choice of what to drink was more than preference, it was often a matter of life and death. In a world where rivers and wells could be easily polluted by waste, people turned to alternatives that might seem unusual to us today but were deeply embedded in their daily lives. The medieval drink table was ruled by ale, wine, mead, and herbal concoctions, each wrapped in superstition, economy, and social identity. The first and most common drink was ale. For peasants, ale was as ordinary as bread. But it was not the potent beer we know today. Instead, it was a weaker brew known as small ale. With only a fraction of the alcohol content of modern beer, it was safe to drink, filling, and often consumed by everyone in the household, including children. Brewing ale was part of household labor, particularly for women. In fact, many medieval women, known as alewives, made small-scale businesses selling ale in villages. They became recognizable figures with their tall hats and brewing sticks outside their doors, symbols that some historians believe later influenced the imagery of witches. Strong ale existed as well, but it was more expensive and reserved for festivals, soldiers, or tavern gatherings. Ale was so central to life that records show entire villages depending on it, with some workers partly paid in beer. To imagine a medieval day is to picture farmhands setting out to work after breakfasting on bread and ale, pausing at midday for more of the same, and ending their labors with yet another jug of ale beside the fire. Wine, though romanticized today, was largely a drink of the wealthy and of southern Europe. In regions like France, Italy, and Spain, vineyards supplied locals with cheap and plentiful wine. In Northern Europe, however, wine was a luxury, imported at high cost and therefore reserved for nobles, clergy, and urban elites. A goblet of red wine at a feast carried symbolic weight, marking refinement and status. But wine was not always pure. It was often mixed with water to stretch it further, or spiced with herbs, honey, or even seawater to preserve and flavor it. Sweetened, spiced wines called hippocras were popular among the rich, served at the end of banquets as a digestive treat. For the poor, however, wine was a rare indulgence, far less familiar than the everyday mug of ale. Mead, the fermented drink made from honey, also held an important place, especially in earlier medieval centuries and in northern lands where honey was more available than grapevines. Mead was both a drink and a symbol, tied to celebration, ritual, and even mythology. In Norse traditions, it was linked with gods and poetry. Though its production was costly, it remained part of festivals and special occasions long into the Middle Ages, associated with feasting and community. Beyond these staples, medieval people also consumed an array of unusual concoctions and medicinal brews. Monks in monasteries experimented with herbs, roots, and distilled spirits, creating tonics that were intended to cure illness or balance the humors. Some of these drinks worked as mild antiseptics or stimulants, but others were outright dangerous. Recipes survive that called for blending wine with powdered emerald, mercury, or even ground-up toads. Patients desperate for healing swallowed these mixtures, believing that the power of nature or divine blessing resided within. In reality, many of these so-called cures only worsened their suffering. Superstition shaped drinking habits as much as practicality. Beer was believed to strengthen the body and protect against disease, while wine was thought to purify the blood. Some peasants carried charms or whispered blessings over their cups, convinced that evil spirits could lurk in drink. At the same time, drinking itself was woven into the rhythms of religion. Monks famously brewed beer, not only for themselves but for pilgrims and travelers. Their breweries became both sources of income and acts of hospitality, and in some orders, beer was seen as part of God's provision, a holy alternative to contaminated water. Water itself deserves mention, for while it was not entirely avoided, it was treated with suspicion. Wells and streams could easily be polluted by waste, animal carcasses, or runoff from towns. In rural villages, spring water was sometimes drunk when it was fresh, but in crowded cities, it was often unsafe. As a result, water rarely stood alone, it was boiled into broths, flavored with herbs, or mixed with wine or ale. Drinking straight water could mark someone as poor or desperate, while to avoid it signified caution and knowledge of the dangers. The culture of drinking was also social. Taverns and alehouses were centers of village life, where workers gathered to talk, sing, gamble, and share news. These places often blurred the line between merriment and trouble, fights broke out, debts accumulated, and moralists warned of the dangers of drunkenness. The church frequently preached against overindulgence, portraying drunkenness as a gateway to sin, but even clergy themselves were not immune. Monastic records reveal complaints of excessive drinking among brothers, and councils repeatedly attempted to regulate alcohol consumption. The contrast between drinks of the rich and the poor reveals much about medieval life. Where a noble might sip hippocras in a jeweled goblet, a peasant might drink cloudy ale from a shared wooden cup. Where a lord could choose between aged wine or mead spiced with saffron, a farmer quenched his thirst with small ale brewed in his wife's kitchen. Yet despite the differences, both noble and peasant shared a reliance on drink as central to daily existence, a reminder of how dangerous their water supplies truly were. To modern eyes, the sheer dependence on alcohol may seem extraordinary, but in the context of the medieval world, it made perfect sense. Drinking ale or wine was safer than water, provided calories and energy, and offered a measure of comfort in lives marked by hardship. But it also carried risks, from poisoning by toxic additives, to illness from poor brewing, to the moral dangers feared by the church. In every cup, whether of ale, wine, or mead, medieval people tasted not only nourishment but also the complicated balance of necessity, pleasure, and fear. Thus, the drinks of the Middle Ages were far from ordinary. They were daily companions, spiritual symbols, and sometimes dangerous experiments. To lift a mug in the medieval world was to participate in traditions that shaped identity, community, and survival. And behind every sip lay the deeper story of a society navigating the perils of its environment with creativity, ritual, and a touch of superstition. If daily bread and ale formed the backbone of medieval life, then famine and faith were the forces that shaped when, how, and what people ate. In an age where harvests determined survival and religion governed the rhythms of the year, food was never simply a matter of appetite. It was at once fragile, sacred, and deeply feared. Scarcity could push communities into desperation, while religious devotion could demand restraint even when hunger gnawed at the belly. This tension between famine and faith defined the medieval relationship with food more than any royal banquet ever did. The greatest terror in the medieval imagination was not war or plague but hunger. A failed harvest meant misery, and when several failed in succession, disaster struck. The most infamous case was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which swept across much of northern Europe. Chroniclers wrote of torrential rains that ruined crops, drowned livestock, and left fields sodden. Grain prices skyrocketed, and entire villages starved. Eyewitnesses described people eating cats, dogs, and horses, while others foraged desperately for roots, weeds, and acorns. Some accounts even claimed that corpses were dug up and eaten. Whether true or exaggerated, such stories reflect the terror of starvation that haunted communities. Mothers were said to abandon children they could no longer feed, and desperate fathers risked execution by stealing from granaries. For those who survived, the memory of famine was a wound that never healed, a reminder that survival itself was always uncertain. Hunger was not confined to those catastrophic years. Smaller famines or shortages recurred constantly due to bad weather, pests, or war disrupting supply lines. In these times, people turned to famine foods, makeshift substitutes for bread. Bark was ground into flour, acorns roasted and crushed, and straw mixed into dough to create bitter, barely edible loaves. Such bread could cause stomach pains and long-term health problems, but it was better than nothing. In extreme situations, rumors of cannibalism surfaced again and again, suggesting how closely starvation pushed people to the edge of the unthinkable. Alongside famine stood the strict hand of faith. Christianity permeated medieval life, and nowhere was its influence more visible than on the dinner table. The Church imposed countless fast days throughout the year: Fridays, Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Vigils of Saints, and more. Altogether, these could add up to nearly half the calendar, during which meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden. For those already living close to the edge of malnutrition, such rules demanded enormous sacrifice. Yet compliance was expected, for to break a fast was not just disobedience but a sin with eternal consequences. Fish became the great substitute. Eels, herring, cod, and freshwater fish filled markets, rivers, and ponds, sustaining people during religious fasts. Monasteries controlled fisheries and became major suppliers. Wealthier households might enjoy fresh salmon or imported sturgeon, while peasants relied on salted herring, often dried so hard it had to be beaten with a hammer before cooking. Eels in particular were beloved and abundant, slithering in rivers and marshes, and were so valuable they could be used to pay rent or taxes. Even kings accepted rents in barrels of eels. Vegetables and legumes also carried people through fasts. Peas, beans, lentils, and cabbage were common, though their preparation was often plain. The Church insisted that fasting be not only a dietary restriction but also a spiritual discipline. To abstain from meat was to imitate Christ's suffering, to purify the body, and to control sinful appetites. Thus, food was tied to salvation. Eating was not only about filling the stomach but also about securing the soul. Still, human nature often found ways around the rules. Creative cooks developed rich dishes from fish and eggs disguised as something else, or almond milk used to mimic dairy. Nobles could afford the luxury of elaborate substitutes, while peasants simply obeyed or risked punishment. Confessors heard sins of gluttony, and preachers thundered warnings against overindulgence. Eating too much, too richly, or in violation of fasts could endanger not just one's health but one's eternal life. In this way, the dinner table became a battleground of morality. The interplay of famine and faith reveals how fragile and yet how regulated medieval food culture truly was. On one side loomed the uncontrollable forces of nature, rain, frost, insects, and disease that could destroy entire harvests in weeks. On the other stood the unyielding authority of the Church, dictating what one could eat on sacred days and threatening damnation for disobedience. Between these extremes, the common person tried to survive, praying for good weather, storing grain, observing fasts, and hoping for divine mercy. Perhaps most striking is how hunger itself was spiritualized. Chroniclers often described famines as punishments from God for collective sins. A bad harvest was not just an agricultural failure but a moral failure of society. Famine was a sermon written into nature, calling people to repentance. The suffering of the body was interpreted as a warning for the soul. At the same time, feeding the hungry became one of the greatest acts of Christian charity, and monasteries distributed bread and fish to the poor during hard times. In the logic of the Middle Ages, food shortages were both divine punishment and divine opportunity, to sin or to serve. To modern eyes, this intertwining of famine and faith seems both cruel and deeply revealing. Food was never secure, and yet even in insecurity, people were asked to sacrifice more. Scarcity sharpened fear, while religion gave it meaning. For a peasant mother breaking bread with her children, every bite was weighted with more than hunger, it was tied to her family's survival, her community's safety, and her soul's salvation. For a monk in a cloister, every fast day was a chance to discipline the flesh and resist temptation. For a noble, fasting might be an inconvenience, but it was also a visible demonstration of piety and power. Thus, medieval meals cannot be understood only as calories consumed. They were spiritual performances, desperate improvisations, and sometimes acts of sheer survival. Whether gnawing famine bread made from bark or savoring salted herring on a holy day, people ate under the shadow of both hunger and holiness. In this world, every loaf was a gift, every meal an uncertain blessing, and every fast a reminder that life itself was as fragile as the harvest. To live in the Middle Ages was to taste both fear and faith in every bite. If food and drink were the daily struggle of medieval life, clothing was its daily armor. It protected the body from cold and damp, announced one's social rank, and even revealed moral and religious values. Yet much like food, what people wore in the Middle Ages was profoundly unequal. The luxurious silks and fur-lined cloaks of the nobility dazzled in illuminated manuscripts, but the reality for most men and women was far plainer, stitched together from rough fabrics, patched again, and often carrying the dirt and sweat of years of use. To understand medieval clothing is to understand both survival and status, a fabric that held together society itself. For peasants, clothing was first and foremost about endurance. Winters in northern Europe were long, wet, and brutal, while summers brought scorching fields and blistering labor. Most peasants wore garments made of coarse wool, spun and woven at home or purchased at local markets. Wool was scratchy, heavy, and often uncolored, leaving peasants clothed in muted browns, grays, and earthy tones. Undergarments, when available, were made of linen, which was softer and easier to wash, though linen was costly to produce and often out of reach for the poorest families. The standard outfit for a peasant man consisted of a tunic that fell to the knees, belted at the waist, with hose or simple leggings beneath. On his feet were rough leather shoes, often homemade and sometimes stuffed with moss or straw for insulation. A cloak fastened with a simple brooch offered extra warmth in winter. For women, clothing was similar in its simplicity, a long wool dress, usually belted, with a linen shift underneath and a head covering of linen or wool. Women rarely left their heads uncovered. Modesty, piety, and practicality demanded veils, wimples, or simple cloth caps. Clothing for peasants was rarely new. Garments were passed down, patched repeatedly, and repurposed into rags when too worn to wear. Archaeological finds of shoes show extensive repairs, sometimes with scraps of wood or fabric stitched into soles. Lice and fleas infested seams, and laundry was infrequent, as washing required significant effort, soap was scarce, and clothes were too few to set aside for cleaning. The result was clothing that bore the marks of survival, often reeking of sweat, earth, and smoke from hearth fires. By contrast, the nobility and wealthy townspeople used clothing to broadcast status. Silks, velvets, and fine linens imported from Italy, Byzantium, or even the Middle East marked wealth as clearly as jewels. Nobles dressed in layers of bright, richly dyed fabrics. Dyes themselves were luxury items, deep scarlet from Kermes insects, brilliant blue from woad or imported indigo, and rich purple reserved for the highest ranks. To wear bright colors was to proclaim prosperity, to wear fur was to announce authority. Ermine, sable, and fox lined the cloaks of kings and dukes, while even wealthy merchants adorned themselves with lamb or rabbit. The display of wealth through clothing grew so excessive that rulers across Europe introduced sumptuary laws, regulations dictating who could wear what. A merchant might be forbidden from wearing silk, or a knight's wife barred from donning ermine. These laws were less about limiting extravagance and more about preserving social hierarchy. Clothes were visual language, and a poor man dressing above his station threatened the natural order. To disobey was not merely vanity but a kind of social rebellion. The making of clothing was laborious, involving entire communities. Wool had to be sheared, washed, carded, spun into thread, and woven on looms. Linen came from flax, which required soaking, beating, and combing before weaving. Dyeing demanded vats of hot water, with urine sometimes used as a mordant to set colors. Tanners soaked hides in urine and animal brains to soften leather, while shoemakers stitched together boots and sandals. Every garment carried the mark of long labor, and for poorer families, much of this work was done by hand at home. Beyond protection and status, clothing also reflected morality and faith. The Church preached against vanity, condemning extravagant dress as sinful pride. Yet it also prescribed forms of religious attire, monks and nuns in simple habits, friars in rough wool, pilgrims marked by scallop shells or badges sewn to cloaks. Ordinary Christians might wear crosses or small tokens sewn into garments as spiritual protection. In an age of constant fear of disease, demons, and misfortune, clothing often carried charms, herbs, or relics tucked into hems or sewn into belts. Knights and soldiers wore clothing that blended fashion with function. Under armor, padded gambesons protected the body, while surcoats embroidered with coats of arms identified the warrior on the battlefield. These garments became symbolic, turning clothing into heraldry and visual propaganda. For women of noble rank, clothing became an expression of family alliances and wealth. Gowns with long trailing sleeves, elaborate headdresses, and jeweled belts transformed the female body into a statement of lineage and honor. Yet the line between noble and peasant clothing was not absolute. During festivals or weddings, even peasants might save up for a more colorful tunic or a bright ribbon to adorn a cap. Second-hand clothing markets thrived, with cast-off garments of the wealthy resold to the middle classes. In towns, ambitious merchants and guildsmen used clothing to climb the ladder of respectability, pushing against the rigid lines of class. To wear a fine cloak was to stake a claim not only to warmth but to dignity. But for all its symbolic weight, clothing was always practical at its core. In winter, peasants layered garments for warmth, often sleeping fully dressed. Cloaks doubled as blankets. In summer, tunics were shorter and lighter, though the sun still scorched laborers working the fields. Shoes were precious, and many peasants went barefoot in warmer months to preserve their footwear for winter. Children wore miniature versions of adult clothes, often handed down through siblings until threadbare. Nothing was wasted, even scraps of cloth were rewoven or quilted into new forms. The stark contrast between rich and poor wardrobes reveals the inequalities of medieval life, but it also highlights shared human needs. Whether wrapped in silks or wool rags, people dressed to shield themselves from the elements, to conform to social norms, and to protect their bodies from the ever-present dangers of the world around them. Clothes were never neutral, they marked who belonged where, who had power, who had faith, and who was barely surviving. To step into the medieval world is to see garments not as costumes in old paintings but as living, breathing necessities. A peasant woman patching her husband's tunic by candlelight, a noble striding into a hall in crimson velvet, a monk pulling his hood tight against the cold, all reveal the story of survival stitched into fabric. The Middle Ages was a world where clothing was far more than fashion. It was identity, morality, hierarchy, and endurance woven into every thread. If food filled the stomach and clothing wrapped the body, then water was the element that touched every part of medieval life. Yet the medieval world's relationship with water was far more complex than simple thirst. Water was life and danger, healing and corruption, luxury and necessity. It flowed through villages and cities, carving pathways into daily survival, shaping beliefs about health, purity, and morality. To speak of water in the Middle Ages is to confront both the scarcity of cleanliness and the ingenuity with which people tried to achieve it. At its most basic level, water meant drinking. For the poor, fresh water was often drawn from rivers, streams, or wells. Wells were communal, and many villages had only one, so fetching water was a constant daily chore, most often performed by women and children. Buckets of wood or leather hauled up heavy loads that might be carried for miles. But water was not always safe. Streams were easily polluted by human waste, animal droppings, or the runoff from tanneries and dye houses. In cities, waste flowed into open gutters, and rivers became both lifelines and cesspits. To drink from them was to risk illness, yet people had few alternatives. This danger of contaminated water partly explains why ale and beer became the daily drink of much of Europe. Brewing required boiling water, which killed many harmful microbes, though medieval people did not understand the science. What they did know was that beer, even weak, small ale, was safer and often more nourishing than plain water. For the wealthy, wine provided another alternative, though even this was often diluted with water. Clean, fresh water was a rarity, and when it was found, it was treasured. But water was not only for drinking. It was also tied deeply to the question of bathing and bodily cleanliness. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did bathe, though not with the frequency or ease we expect today. Bathhouses, both public and private, existed in many towns, offering heated tubs and sometimes steam rooms. These establishments were often social centers, where men and women might gather, relax, and even eat while soaking. Yet bathhouses carried a reputation for immorality as well, some doubled as brothels, and the mixing of sexes drew suspicion from moral authorities. Over time, as the church grew stricter and fears of disease spread, public bathing declined, but it never entirely disappeared. In the countryside, bathing was simpler. People washed in rivers, lakes, or wooden tubs filled with heated water when fuel was available. For peasants, a full-body bath was rare, usually reserved for special occasions such as holidays, weddings, or childbirth. More common was the practice of partial washing, hands and face in the morning, perhaps feet at night. Washing before meals was considered proper, and basins with water and towels were often provided in wealthier households for guests. Cleanliness, while limited, was valued, not dismissed. Soap existed but was a luxury. Early medieval soap was made from animal fat mixed with ashes or lye, producing a harsh substance that could clean but also irritate skin. In many homes, people substituted simple scrubbing with sand, herbs, or rough cloths. Wealthier families sometimes imported finer soaps from regions like Aleppo, scented with herbs or oils, transforming washing into a sensory indulgence. Yet for the majority, cleanliness was achieved through laborious scrubbing rather than luxury products. Water also carried spiritual meaning. Baptism was the first rite of Christian life, symbolizing purity and rebirth through water. Holy water was sprinkled in churches, carried in small vials by pilgrims, and used to bless fields, animals, and homes. Water was believed to drive away demons, cleanse sins, and protect against disease when sanctified. To wash the body was not only physical but often seen as a symbolic act of washing the soul. Pilgrims traveling to holy sites often washed in sacred springs, believed to cure illness or grant divine favor. Yet despite these practices, disease and dirt remained constant companions. Without modern plumbing, sewage disposal, or soap production, the battle against filth was ongoing. Fleas, lice, and vermin thrived in clothing and bedding, and washing alone could not defeat them. The Black Death and later plagues only deepened suspicion about bathing. Some physicians warned that warm baths opened the pores, allowing disease to enter the body. As a result, the later Middle Ages saw a decline in communal bathing, as fear replaced relaxation with anxiety. In castles and noble houses, bathing was both practical and ceremonial. Lords and ladies bathed in large wooden tubs, sometimes lined with linen for comfort, with servants pouring heated water from jugs. Perfumed oils, flower petals, and scented herbs might be added for fragrance and luxury. Bathing could even be staged as a form of entertainment, with musicians playing nearby. For the wealthy, to wash was not merely to clean but to display refinement and power. The bath became a stage, where water turned into a symbol of status. Meanwhile, the poor found water through improvisation. Rainwater was collected in barrels, sometimes boiled for cooking and washing. During droughts, water became scarce, and its absence could devastate entire communities. Wells could dry up, rivers could shrink, and the consequences were famine and disease. In contrast, floods could ruin harvests and spread filth across villages. Water was unpredictable, and living at its mercy was part of the medieval condition. The effort to stay clean extended to clothing and household items as well. Laundry was a monumental task, usually performed by women at riversides or communal washhouses. Clothes were scrubbed, pounded, and rinsed repeatedly, often with the aid of lye or urine, which acted as a bleaching agent. For poorer families, laundry might be done only a few times a year, with garments worn until nearly stiff with grime. In wealthier homes, laundry maids were employed full-time to keep up with the endless demand for clean linens, a prized possession that marked status and refinement. It is tempting to imagine medieval people as wholly unwashed, but this would be unfair. They valued cleanliness but lacked the means to achieve it fully. They improvised, using herbs like rosemary, sage, or lavender to freshen hair and garments. They rubbed teeth with cloths dipped in ashes or salt. They trimmed nails with knives and combed lice from hair with fine-toothed combs. Cleanliness was relative, and by their standards, many considered themselves properly maintained even if, by modern eyes, they lived in filth. Water, then, was both gift and challenge. It gave life, quenched thirst, and offered the possibility of refreshment, yet it also spread disease, carried waste, and fueled anxieties. Medieval men and women lived in a world where every drop was precious, where washing was both a privilege and a burden, and where the search for purity, physical and spiritual, was never complete. To imagine the medieval world is to picture not only grand castles and soaring cathedrals but also women bending over rivers, scrubbing garments against stones, peasants hauling buckets from deep wells, nobles reclining in perfumed baths, monks chanting as they sprinkled holy water across fields. It is to see a society built on water, struggling endlessly with the paradox of a substance that was both salvation and peril. If food and water kept medieval people alive, clothing defined how they were seen. To dress in the Middle Ages was never a simple matter of warmth or protection. Garments revealed social class, moral character, even spiritual state. Every layer, every fabric, every color carried meaning. What someone wore could open doors to privilege or close them forever. In a world of rigid hierarchies, clothes were both survival and spectacle, tools of necessity and symbols of power. For the peasantry, clothing was utilitarian. The daily garb of most men and women was made from coarse wool, spun and woven locally. Wool was the universal fabric, cheap, durable, and capable of being adapted to every climate. In winter, thick, undyed wool tunics and cloaks offered warmth. In summer, lighter weaves allowed for breathability. Linen, though harder to produce, provided undergarments, shirts, shifts, and chemises worn next to the skin. These pieces absorbed sweat and dirt, protecting the outer garments from wear. Peasant men typically wore tunics belted at the waist, hose or simple trousers, and leather shoes or wooden clogs. Women wore long gowns or kirtles, often with aprons, and their hair was modestly covered with veils or wimples. Everything was patched, repaired, and worn until it fell apart. Clothes were not fashion statements but lifelines. Yet even among the poor, clothing carried quiet meaning. A bride might wear her best shift and add small embroidery to mark her new life. Seasonal festivals encouraged bright dyes when possible, cheap yellows from weld, reds from madder, or browns from oak bark. These colors faded quickly, but for brief moments they allowed peasants to stand out against the gray monotony of everyday wear. Hand-me-downs circulated constantly, and garments often outlived their original owners, reshaped or resized until scraps were sewn into rags. In contrast, the clothing of the wealthy was designed to dazzle. Nobles, merchants, and clergy used fabric as their most visible display of status. Rich velvets, fine silks, and costly furs transformed their bodies into moving symbols of wealth. Imported silk from Byzantium or later from the East was prized, as were brocades woven with gold or silver threads. Fur linings, from squirrel, marten, or ermine, turned cloaks into declarations of authority. A lady draped in ermine and silk was not only warm, she was unmistakably powerful. The cut of garments also carried meaning. By the 12th and 13th centuries, noble fashion began to experiment with tighter fits and longer trains, garments that served no practical purpose other than display. Men wore long tunics with flowing sleeves, while women's gowns extended to the ground, trailing behind them in deliberate impracticality. The length of one's sleeves or hem could signal status as clearly as a title. By the 14th and 15th centuries, men's clothing grew shorter and tighter, emphasizing the legs and hips, while women's gowns featured elaborate necklines and fitted bodices. These shifts scandalized moralists, who decried them as immodest, yet the trends persisted, for fashion was as much about defiance as it was about beauty. Colors, too, spoke their own language. Deep dyes such as royal purple or true scarlet were reserved for the richest, as they required rare and costly ingredients. Blue, made from imported indigo or woad, became a popular symbol of piety, especially in depictions of the Virgin Mary. Green carried associations with youth and fertility, while black, once difficult to produce, eventually became a mark of sophistication. To wear bright, saturated colors was to declare oneself part of the elite, to wear faded or undyed cloth was to be marked as poor. The medieval church took clothing seriously, often linking outward garments to inward virtue. Modesty was a recurring theme. Women were urged to cover their hair and avoid excessive ornamentation, while men were warned against vanity and luxurious excess. Yet clergy themselves often wore rich vestments, embroidered with gold and precious stones, as symbols of the glory of God. Monks and nuns, by contrast, wore plain habits in black, white, or brown, a daily reminder of humility and renunciation. The contrast between glittering bishops and austere monks reflected the broader contradictions of medieval life, where simplicity and extravagance coexisted uneasily. Clothing laws reinforced these divisions. Sumptuary laws, issued by kings and city councils, dictated who could wear what. In England, laws forbade peasants from wearing furs, silks, or bright dyes, restricting such luxuries to the nobility. In Italy, merchants were often targeted with regulations to prevent them from dressing above their station. These laws aimed to preserve the visual order of society, ensuring that wealth alone could not erase the appearance of hierarchy. To dress too richly for one's class could invite suspicion, fines, or even accusations of deception. Yet clothing also allowed for moments of rebellion and aspiration. Wealthy merchants ignored sumptuary laws, using their fortunes to buy silk and jewels to rival the nobility. Young men flaunted scandalously short tunics that barely covered their thighs, earning criticism but also admiration. Women wore hennons, towering conical hats with flowing veils, despite being mocked as vain and impractical. Fashion, like today, was both conformity and defiance, a way of fitting in and standing out at once. Clothes were also bound to the cycle of life. Infants were swaddled tightly in linen, wrapped like small bundles for protection and warmth. Children wore scaled-down versions of adult garments, learning from an early age to inhabit their social role through clothing. Brides were adorned in their finest gowns, often borrowed or reworked, while widows marked their grief with somber black or dull gray. Even in death, clothing carried weight. The wealthy might be buried in fine shrouds or habits from monastic orders, believing the garment itself could aid the soul in its journey. For the traveler or soldier, clothing had to endure hardship. Cloaks protected against rain and cold, while sturdy boots carried men across muddy roads and battlefields. Armor itself was as much clothing as weapon, combining layers of linen, leather, chain, and plate. A knight's surcoat bore his heraldry, transforming him into a living banner. Here, clothing was both shield and symbol, marking the body as both vulnerable and powerful. Perhaps most revealing is how clothing shaped the medieval imagination of morality and fear. The devil was often depicted wearing wild, mismatched furs, symbolizing chaos and excess, while saints were shown in modest robes, signifying purity. Clothing was a metaphor for the soul. To be well-dressed was to be orderly and virtuous, to be ragged or immodest was to risk sin. Yet this moral symbolism often clashed with the reality of human vanity. Just as today, medieval people craved beauty, admired elegance, and judged one another by appearance. In the end, to dress the medieval body was to participate in a constant negotiation between need and display, poverty and pride, survival and aspiration. A peasant in patched wool and a queen in jeweled velvet were separated not only by wealth but by the stories their clothes told. Each garment was a thread in the larger fabric of society, weaving together identity, hierarchy, and hope. Clothing was not just what people wore, it was who they were, who they wished to be, and how the world saw them. In the flicker of torchlight at a feast, in the mud of a village lane, in the solemn hush of a cathedral, garments spoke louder than words. They whispered of hunger and hardship, of power and ambition, of faith and fear. And in that whisper, the medieval body was wrapped not only in fabric but in meaning. If food, water, and clothing sustained the body, fear sustained the imagination of the Middle Ages. To live in that era was to inhabit a world shadowed by uncertainty, where disease struck without warning, storms ruined crops, and death walked silently through village lanes. Science, as we understand it, offered little comfort. Instead, fear was explained through superstition, religion, and folklore. The medieval person did not simply worry about hunger or war but about curses, demons, witches, and signs in the sky. Fear was woven into the fabric of everyday life, shaping choices and behavior as much as bread and wool. One of the deepest fears was the night itself. After sunset, the world became a place of danger. With no streetlights, no electricity, and only the dim glow of candles or torches, darkness swallowed villages and cities whole. To step outside was to risk stumbling into thieves, wolves, or worse, spirits that haunted crossroads and forests. People told stories of restless dead who wandered at night, punishing the living for their sins. The creak of a shutter, the howl of a dog, or the flicker of a shadow could spark terror, for the night was not empty but crowded with invisible presences. Dreams were no escape. Nightmares were believed to be literal attacks by demons or witches. The night hag, or mare, was thought to sit upon the chest of a sleeper, suffocating them and leaving them breathless upon waking. From this belief comes the very word nightmare. To combat such terrors, people slept with charms, relics, or crosses near their beds. Some carried amulets of iron or wore herbs like St. John's wort, believed to ward off evil spirits. Even the simple act of making the sign of the cross before sleep was seen as a shield against unseen dangers. Animals, too, carried ominous meaning. Owls, with their haunting cries, were considered harbingers of death. Cats, particularly black ones, were often linked to witches, accused of being their familiars or even witches in disguise. Dogs howling at night were believed to signal an impending death in the household. Crows circling above a field might be interpreted as a sign of famine or plague. To medieval eyes, the natural world was alive with messages, each sound or movement carrying supernatural weight. The greatest terror of all was disease. The Black Death of the 14th century burned fear into the collective psyche of Europe. Whole towns were emptied, families wiped out in days. But even before and after the plague, illnesses were constant threats: leprosy, smallpox, ergotism, and fevers without names. With no understanding of germs, people explained disease through divine punishment, poisoned wells, or malevolent magic. Lepers were shunned, made to wear bells to announce their presence, feared as both contagious and cursed. A sudden sickness in a household might prompt accusations of witchcraft, for someone had to be blamed. The sky itself was watched with trembling eyes. Eclipses, comets, and strange lights were seen as portents of doom. Chroniclers wrote that comets heralded war or famine, and lunar eclipses signaled God's anger. The year 1348, when the Black Death struck, also brought reports of fiery comets streaking across the heavens, which people interpreted as warnings of the catastrophe to come. In a world where celestial events had no scientific explanation, every shift in the sky was a message from above. Magic and witchcraft were constant undercurrents in this climate of fear. Though large-scale witch trials came later, medieval people already lived with suspicions of curses, spells, and charms. A neighbor's bad luck might be blamed on another's evil eye. A child's sudden illness might be blamed on a curse whispered in envy. To protect themselves, people carried talismans, bones of saints, pieces of parchment inscribed with holy verses, or simple knots tied in string. These objects blurred the line between religion and superstition, offering comfort in a world where little felt secure. Not all fears were supernatural. The medieval world was also haunted by very real dangers: war, fire, and famine. Armies marching through fields left destruction in their wake. Wooden houses and thatched roofs made cities vulnerable to sudden, devastating fires. A single spark could consume entire neighborhoods. Villages stored grain in barns that could be ruined by rats, mold, or flood, pushing families toward starvation. Fear was practical as much as spiritual, and every household lived under the shadow of disaster. The Church both calmed and intensified these fears. On one hand, priests assured the faithful that salvation awaited those who obeyed God. On the other, sermons were filled with threats of hellfire, demons, and eternal torment. Fear was not only a daily experience but also a tool of control, shaping behavior through promises of punishment. Tales of purgatory circulated widely, describing souls suffering in flames until their sins were purged. To medieval minds, death was not the end but the beginning of even greater fear. Children grew up surrounded by these warnings. Mothers taught them prayers to keep away evil spirits. Fathers told cautionary tales about those who strayed too far into the woods. Folk tales of werewolves, fairies, and giants reinforced the lesson that danger lurked everywhere, both natural and supernatural. Fear educated as much as it terrified, serving as a guide for how to live safely within a perilous world. Yet fear was not only crippling, it was also unifying. Communities shared their terrors, told stories together by firelight, prayed together during plagues, and built rituals to confront the unknown. Fear bonded people as much as bread or wine, reminding them of their shared fragility. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with constant anxiety, but it was also to live with shared coping strategies: prayer, story, ritual, and superstition. Perhaps what makes medieval fear most striking today is how familiar it feels. The details may differ: comets, demons, and witches rather than viruses and pollution, but the human impulse to explain uncertainty through imagination remains the same. Fear, in the Middle Ages, was not simply irrational terror but a lens through which people interpreted the world. It gave shape to the unseen, order to the chaos, and meaning to suffering. In every shadow at night, every strange dream, every illness, every flicker of light in the sky, medieval people saw signs. To us, they may seem like fantasies or ignorance. To them, they were survival. Fear was not a weakness but a strategy, a way of making sense of a fragile existence. In the silence of medieval nights, broken only by the rustle of animals or the toll of a distant bell, that fear was as present as the air itself, invisible, inescapable, and utterly human. If hunger and fear shaped the daily struggles of medieval life, then feasts and festivals offered rare moments of abundance, spectacle, and release. These events were not simply about food or merriment, they were stages upon which power was displayed, hierarchies reinforced, and communities temporarily united in joy. From the solemn liturgies of religious holidays to the extravagant banquets of kings, the medieval calendar was punctuated by moments when ordinary life gave way to extraordinary ritual. At the heart of the medieval year were religious festivals. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the feast days of saints structured the rhythm of time. These days were marked by processions, church services, and communal meals. Bells rang out across villages, banners were carried through streets, and altars were decorated with flowers and candles. The liturgy itself became a performance, filled with incense, song, and ritual. To the faithful, these festivals were reminders of the eternal story of salvation. To the community, they were occasions of collective identity, when even the poorest could share in the glory of sacred time. But festivals were not only solemn. Carnival, the raucous period before the fasting season of Lent, turned the world upside down. In towns across Europe, masks were donned, parades filled the streets, and fools mocked authority. Men dressed as women, peasants dressed as kings, and order dissolved into joyful chaos. Carnival was a temporary inversion of the rules, a safety valve that allowed the frustrations of daily life to be expressed in laughter and excess. Yet when Lent began, the laughter ended, and order was restored. Such cycles of release and restraint reflected the medieval belief that joy and discipline must coexist. Feasting was another key arena where power was performed. A medieval banquet was more than a meal, it was a theater of status. Kings and nobles staged banquets to celebrate victories, seal alliances, or display their wealth. Tables groaned with roasted meats, boar, venison, swan, and peacock, alongside spiced pies, almond pastries, and jellied delicacies. Exotic ingredients like sugar, saffron, and pepper, imported from distant lands, testified to wealth and connections. Wine flowed freely, often flavored with honey or spices. To be invited to such a feast was to be recognized, to sit at the high table was to be honored. Yet even within feasts, hierarchy was carefully observed. The seating arrangement itself was a map of power. The lord sat at the head of the hall, flanked by his most important guests. Servants and musicians occupied the margins, providing service and entertainment. Lower-ranking attendees sat at secondary tables, where the food might be plainer and the portions smaller. This arrangement reinforced social order. Even in abundance, one's place in the hierarchy was clear. Entertainment at feasts ranged from music and poetry to elaborate performances. Minstrels sang ballads of heroes and love. Jugglers, acrobats, and fools amused guests between courses. In the courts of the wealthy, masks, costumed performances with allegorical themes, transformed the hall into a stage. Sometimes entire castles were decorated for a feast, with walls draped in tapestries and tables adorned with golden vessels. The line between dining and theater blurred, for the feast was meant not only to nourish but to impress, to leave no doubt about the Lord's magnificence. While nobles staged lavish spectacles, common people celebrated in their own way. Harvest festivals marked the gathering of crops with dances, bonfires, and shared meals. Villagers roasted animals, brewed ale, and sang songs around fires that blazed into the night. May Day was celebrated with greenery, maypoles, and songs of fertility. Weddings, too, were communal feasts, where neighbors gathered to eat, drink, and dance. Even funerals often included meals, for food bound the living and the dead together in memory. For peasants, these occasions were precious breaks from toil, when scarcity gave way, however briefly, to plenty. Some festivals blurred the line between sacred and profane. The Feast of Fools, celebrated in certain regions, saw clergy parody their own rituals, wearing masks and engaging in comic misbehavior. Though often condemned by church authorities, such festivals persisted, for they allowed communities to mock the very systems that ruled them. These moments of inversion reminded everyone of the fragility of order, and perhaps of the need to laugh at it. The fear of famine made abundance all the more dazzling. To see tables laden with meat and spices, to drink wine until the cup overflowed, was to taste what most could only dream of. For the poor, watching nobles feast could inspire resentment, but it could also create awe, reinforcing the image of lords as larger-than-life figures. The sight of a roasted peacock, its feathers reattached after cooking so it appeared alive, was a spectacle meant to astonish. Such dishes were less about flavor than about the display of wealth and imagination. The Church also used feasts to assert its authority. Monasteries hosted great meals on holy days, feeding both monks and the poor. Cathedrals staged elaborate liturgical dramas on feast days, turning sacred stories into living theater. In such moments, the divine and the earthly merged. Eating, drinking, praying, and performing were all intertwined, for the medieval mind did not separate the sacred from the social. Yet not everyone approved of such extravagance. Preachers warned against gluttony and drunkenness, reminding people that excess led to sin. Satirical poems mocked the greed of nobles who devoured mountains of food while peasants starved. Even within the joy of feasts, the shadow of morality loomed. Abundance was both a blessing and a temptation, and to indulge too far was to risk damnation. Still, the memory of festivals and feasts lingered long after the food was gone. They were moments when the harshness of life softened, when music filled the air and laughter echoed through halls and fields. They were opportunities to see and be seen, to reaffirm bonds, to celebrate survival in a precarious world. For a medieval villager who spent most days bent over fields, the chance to dance around a maypole or share a roasted animal with neighbors was a taste of joy. For a king, a banquet was a chance to display might not only in war but in generosity. In both village green and royal hall, feasts and festivals revealed the heart of medieval life, a longing for abundance, a need for community, and a recognition that joy must be seized whenever it appeared. They were reminders that life, though fragile, could still be celebrated. And in that celebration, whether through sacred ritual or comic misrule, people found meaning, belonging, and the courage to face the uncertainties that awaited when the music faded and the daily toil resumed. If feasts and festivals were stages for joy, then punishments and prisons were stages for fear. In the medieval world, justice was not hidden away behind closed doors but displayed in full view of the community. Punishment was both spectacle and warning, a performance meant to terrify as much as to correct. Authority was reinforced not only through laws but through the sight of bodies suffering, for in an age where survival itself was precarious, pain became a language that everyone could understand. Justice in the Middle Ages was harsh, often brutal, and deeply public. Crimes that threatened order, theft, treason, heresy, witchcraft, even blasphemy, were met with punishments designed not merely to restrain but to humiliate. Stocks and pillories placed offenders in the town square, their bodies trapped in wooden frames as neighbors jeered, threw rotten food, or hurled insults. A thief or adulterer thus became an object lesson in shame, their dishonor serving as a warning to others. Punishment was not only about the guilty, it was about reminding everyone else of the power of law and the dangers of disobedience. More serious crimes brought more terrifying punishments. Execution was a common fate, carried out in ways that reflected the crime itself. Hanging was the ordinary end for thieves. Traitors might be drawn and quartered, their bodies cut into pieces and displayed across the land as a chilling message. Heretics were burned at the stake, their ashes scattered to deny them a grave. Beheadings were reserved for nobles, a cleaner death meant to preserve dignity even in execution. These rituals of death were attended by crowds, sometimes numbering in the thousands. People came not only out of fear but out of fascination, for executions were both horror and entertainment. Punishment was also tied to religious notions of sin and redemption. A criminal's suffering was seen as a cleansing of both body and soul. Pain purified, and public suffering might serve as a kind of penance. The Church often oversaw trials for heresy, witchcraft, or blasphemy, framing punishment as a defense of faith itself. Inquisitions interrogated, tortured, and condemned those who strayed from doctrine. Burning, the most feared of executions, was not only a death but a spectacle of fire, symbolic of both divine wrath and cleansing flame. Yet punishment was not always death. Corporal penalties were common: whippings, branding, mutilation. A thief might have a hand cut off, a liar might have their tongue pierced. Branding marked criminals for life, inscribing their shame on their very skin. Such mutilations ensured that crime left permanent traces, impossible to hide. Even when the body survived, the stigma endured. Fear of dishonor was often as powerful as fear of pain. Prisons in the medieval period were not the vast institutions we imagine today. They were often little more than dungeons, dark, damp, and suffocating spaces beneath castles or town halls. Prisoners languished in filth, chained to walls, their meals little more than stale bread and water. Rats scurried over floors, disease spread unchecked, and hope drained away in the shadows. Prisons were less about long-term punishment and more about holding the accused until trial or execution. To be thrown into a dungeon was to enter a place of despair, where time itself became a form of torment. Torture, though not used in every case, was a tool of interrogation. The rack stretched limbs until joints snapped. The Iron Maiden enclosed bodies in spiked chambers. The wheel shattered bones as bodies were twisted upon it. Even the threat of such devices could break the will of the accused. Torture was justified as a means of extracting truth, though often it produced only screams and false confessions. To the medieval mind, however, suffering was both evidence of guilt and a test of endurance. The innocent, it was believed, might be preserved by divine intervention. Public punishments served social purposes beyond deterrence. They reinforced hierarchy, reminding peasants that nobles held power over life and death. They reinforced morality, showing that sin led to visible consequences. And they reinforced unity, for watching punishment was often a communal act, binding people together through shared fear. A gallows erected in a town square was not just wood and rope, it was a symbol of the Lord's authority, looming over daily life. Fear, however, was a double-edged sword. Sometimes crowds turned against authority. Executions could spark sympathy for the condemned, especially if the punishment was seen as unjust. Saints and martyrs emerged from such spectacles, their courage transforming fear into reverence. Stories spread of condemned heretics singing hymns as flames consumed them, or of traitors facing death with defiance. In these moments, punishment failed to terrify and instead inspired resistance. Authority depended on the performance of fear, but when that performance faltered, power itself was questioned. Even so, punishments were woven into the fabric of medieval imagination. Ballads recounted the deaths of criminals. Woodcuts depicted gallows, wheels, and stakes in lurid detail. Children grew up seeing or hearing tales of executions. The theater of fear seeped into daily life, shaping how people understood justice, sin, and fate. To live in the Middle Ages was to know that misstep could lead not only to shame but to agony, enacted under the gaze of neighbors and strangers alike. Punishment was also deeply unequal. Nobles might escape with fines or exile, while peasants suffered death or mutilation for lesser crimes. Justice was not blind, it was stratified, reflecting the hierarchies of society. Yet even nobles were not untouchable. A traitorous duke could still lose his head, his downfall celebrated as proof that no one, not even the highborn, was beyond the law's reach. In this way, punishment reminded all, rich and poor alike, of the thin line between security and ruin. For the medieval world, prisons and punishments were essential instruments of order, but they were also performances, spectacles that shaped collective memory and emotion. Fear was cultivated deliberately, for fear kept people obedient, bound them to authority, and reminded them of the eternal consequences of sin. The sight of a burning stake, the sound of a whip, the stink of a dungeon, all were part of the sensory language of justice. And yet, within that fear, there was fascination. People gathered not only to tremble but to watch, to whisper, to carry stories back to their homes. Punishment was as much theater as terror. It revealed the fragility of life, the severity of authority, and the dark allure of suffering as spectacle. In a world where joy and terror stood side by side, prisons and punishments were grim stages upon which power was written in fire, iron, and blood. The Middle Ages were not only an age of castles, kings, and battles, but also an age of shadows, shadows cast by unseen forces that people believed shaped every moment of their lives. For men and women living in a world of uncertainty, where famine, disease, and war could strike without warning, superstition became both explanation and defense. The unknown was terrifying, and so it was given names, shapes, and stories. Every creak of the floorboards, every strange animal cry at night, every sudden illness could be an omen. To survive, one had to read the signs, respect them, and fear them. Superstition seeped into daily routines, dictating when to rise, when to plant, when to travel, and even how to speak. A sneeze, for instance, was not just a sneeze, it might be the soul attempting to escape, so people quickly blessed the one who sneezed, protecting them from harm. The twitch of an eye could be read as a message from fate, while dreams were considered gateways to divine or demonic warnings. The line between natural and supernatural was thin, often invisible, and the medieval mind walked it carefully. Animals played a central role in the world of omens. A black cat crossing one's path could herald bad luck, for cats were often associated with witches and the devil. Owls, with their haunting night cries, were thought to bring death. Ravens circling above a home might foretell sickness. Even ordinary creatures, dogs howling at night, crows gathering in fields, were interpreted as messengers of disaster. To the modern mind, these were coincidences. To the medieval mind, they were warnings whispered by nature itself. Superstition was not only about fear, it was about protection. Amulets and charms were worn to ward off evil. A small cross, a saint's relic, or even a simple piece of iron might be carried as a shield against dark forces. Garlic was hung to repel not just disease but demons. Herbs like sage, rue, and mugwort were believed to have magical properties, and women who knew their uses became both healers and targets of suspicion. To live in the Middle Ages was to carry unseen armor, not of steel, but of symbols, prayers, and talismans. Witchcraft loomed large in the imagination. Though accusations of witches were not yet the mass hysteria that would erupt in later centuries, suspicion was constant. Women who lived alone, who healed with herbs, or who seemed different, might be whispered about. A cow that stopped giving milk, a storm that ruined crops, or a sudden infant death could all be blamed on witchcraft. Fear of the witch was really fear of the unknown, a way to give shape to misfortune that could otherwise not be explained. Omens guided major decisions, from harvests to warfare. Kings consulted astrologers before battles, believing that the alignment of planets determined victory or defeat. Farmers planted and harvested according to phases of the moon, trusting that celestial rhythms controlled earthly growth. Even marriages might be arranged with the blessing of the stars, as families sought to secure not only social alliances but cosmic harmony. The heavens, full of patterns beyond human control, became a map of destiny. Yet not all superstitions were grim. Some brought comfort and joy. Finding a four-leaf clover promised luck. Rain falling on a wedding day might be seen as a blessing of fertility. Bells were rung not only to mark the hours of prayer but also to drive away storms and demons, their sound thought to purify the air itself. People lived surrounded by rituals that blended hope with fear, weaving the unseen into the fabric of everyday life. Death, however, was the great shadow that hung over all. With plague, war, and famine a constant threat, people looked for signs of mortality everywhere. Candles sputtering out during prayer might foretell a death in the family. Dogs howling outside the house could mean that death was near. Corpses themselves were thought to send warnings. If a body bled in the presence of its murderer, guilt was revealed. The living carried constant awareness of death, searching the world for hints of its arrival. Ghosts, too, populated the imagination. The dead were believed to linger, restless if not properly buried or prayed for. Tales of spirits wandering churchyards, of spectral armies marching through the night, or of pale figures appearing in forests were common. To encounter a ghost was not only terrifying but also a reminder of the thin veil separating the living from the dead. Priests offered blessings and masses to calm restless souls, while ordinary people avoided certain places at night, fearful of encountering what lingered unseen. Superstition was also political. Leaders used omens to strengthen their authority. A comet streaking across the sky could be declared as divine approval, or divine wrath against an enemy. Miraculous signs, whether healings, visions, or strange natural events, were interpreted to reinforce power. At the same time, common people might resist rulers by interpreting omens differently, spreading stories that undermined authority. Superstition was not just personal belief but also social language, shaping how events were understood and remembered. The Church both encouraged and condemned superstition. Saints' relics, holy water, and blessed objects were promoted as defenses against evil. Yet folk practices that strayed too far into the realm of magic were denounced as pagan or heretical. This tension meant that ordinary people lived in a blend of belief systems, half Christian, half folk magic, creating a culture where prayers might be whispered alongside charms, and where fear of the devil mixed with reverence for the saints. The power of superstition lay not in whether it was true but in how it shaped behavior. Farmers delayed planting if a crow flew the wrong way. A family might keep a newborn indoors for weeks, fearing the evil eye. A soldier might carry a charm into battle, convinced it would turn aside the enemy's blade. These beliefs gave people a sense of control in a world otherwise ruled by uncertainty. In the Middle Ages, the unseen was not a distant concept, it was an intimate presence that touched every decision, every action, every breath. What people feared most were not always the things they could see, swords, fires, or storms, but the things they could not see. A curse whispered, a demon lurking, a star shifting in the heavens. To walk through the medieval world was to walk under constant watch, surrounded by invisible forces that could bless or curse at any moment. The superstitions, omens, and shadows of the unseen were not simply beliefs, they were survival strategies, emotional shields, and the invisible threads that held together a fragile world. Behind the armored knights, behind the stone walls of castles, and behind the bustling markets of medieval towns lay the quieter, more intimate struggles of love, marriage, and family. These bonds were the foundation of society, yet they were fragile, bound not only by affection but also by duty, economics, and survival. In the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely a matter of personal choice, it was a negotiation, a transaction, and sometimes a battlefield of its own. To speak of love in the medieval world is to uncover both tenderness and constraint, both private devotion and public expectation. Marriage was, first and foremost, an alliance. For nobles, it meant securing lands, forging treaties, and strengthening power. Kings and lords arranged unions that could unite kingdoms or prevent wars. A young bride, sometimes no older than 12 or 13, might be married to a man decades older, not because of affection but because of inheritance rights or political strategy. A wedding was less about romance than about property, bloodlines, and obligation. Even among peasants, marriage was a practical affair. Families needed labor, and a spouse was as much a partner in work as in life. Love might grow, but it was not the root from which marriage sprouted. The Church played a central role in defining marriage. By the 12th century, the Church declared marriage a sacrament, a holy bond sanctified by God. Consent, the "I do" spoken by bride and groom, became essential, though in practice, families still controlled most decisions. Weddings were held not in private but in public, often outside the church doors, so the community could witness and affirm the union. The vows were binding, for divorce as we know it today was nearly impossible. Separation could occur, but the church rarely allowed annulments except under unusual circumstances, such as proving that the marriage was never valid to begin with. Love, however, was not absent. Medieval culture celebrated the ideals of courtly love, a tradition born in the courts of southern France and spread across Europe. Troubadours sang of knights who adored unattainable ladies, often married women of higher rank. These romances, filled with longing glances, secret tokens, and forbidden passion, shaped how people dreamed of love, even if real marriages rarely resembled the poetry. Courtly love was dangerous, for it celebrated desire outside of marriage, but it was also intoxicating, offering a vision of passion in a world where duty often overshadowed affection. Within families, roles were rigid. Husbands held authority, expected to provide and protect. Wives managed households, bore children, and labored alongside men in fields or workshops. A wife was legally bound to obey her husband, yet her labor was essential for survival. Women brewed ale, spun wool, baked bread, tended animals, and managed servants if the family was wealthy enough to afford them. In some cases, especially in towns, widows who inherited their husband's trade could become independent and successful businesswomen. Still, life for women was often precarious, shaped by childbirth and the risks it carried. Many women died young, their lives shortened by repeated pregnancies and lack of medical care. Children were precious yet vulnerable. High infant mortality meant that parents lived with constant fear of loss. Baptism was performed quickly after birth, often within days, to secure the child's soul in case of early death. Childhood itself was short. By the age of 7, children were expected to contribute to household work or be sent as apprentices. For noble children, this meant being fostered in other households to learn manners, literacy, or the art of war. For peasant children, it meant laboring in fields, herding animals, or helping in workshops. Yet despite the harsh realities, families did cherish moments of joy, lullabies sung by mothers, simple toys carved by fathers, games played in village streets. Romance and marriage were also haunted by fear. Infidelity carried dire consequences, particularly for women. An unfaithful wife might be shamed, punished, or even executed. Men, though often freer in their affairs, could face ruin if caught dishonoring another noble's wife. Jealousy, suspicion, and scandal could destroy families and reputations. Adultery was not only a sin but a disruption of inheritance lines, threatening the stability of property and lineage. Thus, the family was both a private bond of affection and a public institution carefully guarded by law and custom. Festivities marked the milestones of love and marriage. Weddings were celebrated with feasts, dancing, and drinking, often lasting several days. Songs were sung, riddles exchanged, and symbolic rituals performed, the joining of hands, the sharing of bread and wine, the blessing of the priest. Yet even in celebration, hierarchy and duty were never far. A peasant's modest wedding might be filled with laughter and village merriment, while a noble wedding was staged as a grand display of wealth and power, with banners, musicians, and banquets designed to impress. For widows and widowers, life took on a different shape. Widows, in particular, could gain unexpected freedom.